The morning sun was just breaking through the clouds as 19-year-old Zara packed her small carry-on bag in her aunt's guest room. She was heading back to college after spending 2 wonderful weeks with family in Chicago. As she folded her clothes, her fingers touched something soft and familiar, her grandmother's headscarf. The beautiful piece of fabric was deep blue with golden threads woven throughout, creating patterns that told stories of her family's heritage. Her grandmother had worn it every day until she passed away 3 years ago. Now it was one of Zara's most treasured possessions. Zara wrapped the scarf carefully around her head, just the way her grandmother had taught her. She looked in the mirror and smiled, feeling connected to the woman who had raised her with so much love and wisdom. Today felt like the perfect day to wear it. At the airport, Zara checked in for her flight to Atlanta. The boarding process was smooth, and she was excited to discover she had been upgraded to first class. Her father had arranged it as a surprise, though she didn't know he was behind the upgrade. As she walked down the airplane aisle, Zara noticed other passengers settling into their seats. There was an elderly couple sharing photos on their phone, a businessman typing away on his laptop, and a young mother trying to keep her toddler entertained. The atmosphere felt calm and friendly. Zara found her seat 3A by the window. She put her bag in the overhead compartment and sat down, pulling out a book she wanted to finish during the flight. The seat was comfortable, and she was looking forward to the peaceful journey ahead. That's when she noticed someone watching her. Flight attendant Linda Rodriguez had been working for the airline for 8 years. She prided herself on running a tight ship and keeping everything under control. But as she watched passengers board, her eyes kept going back to the young woman in seat 3A. Linda walked over to Zara's row, her expression stern. She stood in the aisle for a moment, looking down at the college student with obvious disapproval. "Excuse me, miss," Linda said in a sharp tone that made nearby passengers look up from their phones and magazines. Zara looked up from her book with a friendly smile. "Yes, is there something wrong?" "I need you to remove that head covering," Linda announced loudly enough for several rows to hear. "It's against our safety regulations." Zara blinked in surprise. She had flown many times before wearing her grandmother's scarf and had never encountered any problems. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. This is a religious head covering. I've never had any issues flying with it before." Linda crossed her arms and raised her voice even more. "Well, you're having issues now. Our dress code clearly states that head coverings can be a security risk. You need to remove it immediately or we'll have to ask you to leave the plane." The businessman in the seat across the aisle stopped typing and looked over with concern. The elderly couple a few rows back were whispering to each other, shaking their heads in disapproval at Linda's aggressive tone. Zara felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment as more passengers turned to stare at the commotion. She kept her voice calm and respectful. "Ma'am, this is part of my religious practice. I'm not causing any trouble. Could I please speak with the captain about this?" "You don't need to speak with anyone except me," Linda snapped back. "I'm the authority on this aircraft and I'm telling you to remove that thing right now." A woman in her 60s named Mrs. Patterson, sitting 2 rows behind Zara, stood up slowly. "Excuse me, but what exactly is the problem here? That young lady isn't bothering anyone." Linda whipped around to face Mrs. Patterson. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. This doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us when someone is being treated unfairly," Mrs. Patterson replied firmly. "I've been flying for 40 years and I've never seen anything like this." The businessman, David Chen, also spoke up. "I agree with the lady. What safety risk could a headscarf possibly pose? This seems completely unnecessary." Linda felt the situation slipping out of her control, which only made her angrier. She had always been bothered by passengers who she felt didn't belong in first class, and seeing this young woman in expensive seats while wearing what she considered foreign clothing triggered all her worst instincts. "If everyone would mind their own business," Linda said loudly, "we could get this resolved quickly and take off on time." She turned back to Zara, who was still sitting quietly in her seat, clutching her book with trembling hands. The young woman's eyes were beginning to fill with tears, but she was trying hard to maintain her composure. "Last warning," Linda declared. "Remove the head covering now or you're off this plane." Zara looked around at the faces staring at her. Some passengers looked sympathetic, Others seemed uncomfortable with the confrontation, and a few appeared to be supporting Linda's demands. She felt completely alone and humiliated. "Please," Zara said softly. "This belonged to my grandmother. It has deep meaning to me. I'm not trying to cause any problems." Those words seemed to push Linda over the edge. In her mind, this passenger was being defiant and making her look bad in front of everyone. Without warning, Linda reached forward and grabbed the delicate fabric. "If you won't take it off, I'll take it off for you," she snarled. In one swift, violent motion, Linda yanked the headscarf from Zara's head. The force was so sudden and harsh that the beautiful fabric tore in two places where Linda's fingers had gripped it. The golden thread scattered and pieces of the precious heirloom fell to the airplane floor. The cabin fell completely silent. Zara sat frozen in shock, her carefully arranged hair now messy and her scalp stinging from where the scarf had been ripped away. She stared down at the torn pieces of her grandmother's headscarf, the fabric that had been passed down through generations of women in her family, now damaged beyond easy repair. Tears began streaming down her face as the reality of what had just happened sank in. This wasn't just a piece of cloth, it was her connection to her grandmother, her heritage, her faith. And now it lay in pieces on the floor of an airplane, destroyed by someone's ignorance and cruelty. Mrs. Patterson gasped audibly and immediately stood up again. "That was completely unacceptable. You just assaulted that young woman." David Chen was already pulling out his phone to record what was happening. "This is unbelievable. Everyone saw what just occurred here." Other passengers began murmuring among themselves, with many expressing shock and outrage at what they had witnessed. Some were also recording the incident, sensing that something significant had just taken place. Linda, realizing that she might have gone too far, tried to justify her actions. She was being uncooperative and refusing to follow safety protocols. Sometimes we have to take firm action to maintain order. But her words fell flat. Everyone could see that what had happened was wrong. A young woman sitting peacefully in her seat had been physically assaulted and humiliated for wearing a religious head covering. Zara bent down slowly and began picking up the pieces of her grandmother's scarf, her tears falling onto the torn fabric. Each piece she gathered felt like she was collecting fragments of her heart. Zara sat in her seat, holding the torn pieces of her grandmother's headscarf in her trembling hands. The silence in the cabin was so heavy that you could hear the airplane's engines humming in the background. She felt completely exposed and vulnerable, her hair disheveled from the violent way Linda had ripped away the sacred fabric. The tears wouldn't stop coming. Each drop that fell onto the torn material felt like she was mourning, not just for the damaged scarf, but for the dignity that had been stripped away from her in front of all these strangers. She tried to fix her hair with shaking fingers, but nothing could fix the humiliation she felt burning in her chest. Linda stood in the aisle, holding the torn pieces of fabric she had ripped away. For a brief moment, even she seemed shocked by what she had done. But instead of apologizing, she straightened her shoulders and put on a defiant expression. "Well, now that's settled," Linda announced to the cabin, her voice trying to sound authoritative but coming out shaky. "Passengers need to understand that when flight crew gives instructions, they must be followed immediately. We don't have time for arguments when we have a schedule to keep." But the other passengers weren't buying it. Mrs. Patterson was already unbuttoning her cardigan sweater, her face red with anger and determination. "You should be ashamed of yourself," Mrs. Patterson said as she walked over to Zara's seat. "Here, dear, take this." She gently placed her soft gray cardigan around Zara's shoulders and squeezed her hand. "What that woman did to you was completely wrong." Zara looked up at the kind stranger and whispered, "Thank you." Her voice was barely audible, but Mrs. Patterson heard the gratitude in those two simple words. David Chen had been recording everything on his phone since the moment Linda grabbed the scarf. He stood up from his seat across the aisle, his business suit wrinkled from leaning forward to get a better angle. "I got the whole thing on video," he announced loudly. "Everyone here just witnessed an assault. That flight attendant physically attacked a passenger who was sitting quietly in her seat, bothering absolutely nobody." Linda's face went pale. In today's world, she knew that videos could spread across social media in minutes. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a way to control the situation. "Put that phone away right now," she demanded, pointing at David. "Recording is not allowed during boarding." "Actually, it is allowed," said a voice from the back of the plane. A young man in his 20s wearing a college sweatshirt had also been filming. "I'm a journalism student and I know my rights. We're allowed to record as long as we're not interfering with safety procedures." More passengers were now pulling out their phones. The elderly gentleman sitting next to Mrs. Patterson's empty seat was typing furiously on his tablet. A woman in her 30s was already posting on her social media accounts, her fingers flying across her phone screen. "This is unbelievable," the woman muttered as she typed. "Flight attendant just ripped a girl's religious headscarf right off her head. I can't believe what I'm seeing." Linda realized she was losing control of the situation completely. She tried a different approach, putting on what she thought was a concerned expression. "Look, everyone is misunderstanding what happened here," she said, her voice now trying to sound reasonable. "This passenger was being uncooperative and refused to follow basic safety guidelines. Sometimes we have to take action to protect all passengers on board." "Protect us from what?" called out a man from the middle of the cabin. "From a piece of fabric? From a young woman reading a book?" "Yeah, what exactly was she threatening us with?" added another passenger. "Her grandmother's headscarf? Give me a break." The comments kept coming from different parts of the plane. Passengers who had been minding their own business just minutes earlier were now fully engaged in defending Zara. The mood in the cabin had completely shifted against Linda. "She looked dangerous to me," Linda said desperately. But even as the words came out of her mouth, she knew how ridiculous they sounded. Everyone could see Zara clearly. She was a petite college student with a gentle face, wearing a simple sweater and jeans. She had been reading a book about psychology. Hardly the profile of someone who posed any kind of threat to aircraft security. "Dangerous?" Mrs. Patterson repeated incredulously. "That child was reading a textbook. The most dangerous thing about her was probably that she might fall asleep from studying too hard." Some passengers actually laughed at that comment, which made Linda even more frustrated and defensive. Zara finally found her voice again, though it was still shaky from crying. "I just want to call my father," she said softly. "Please, can I just call my father?" Linda saw an opportunity to regain some control. "No phone calls until we're in the air, that's airline policy." But David Chen was already handing Zara his phone. "Here, use mine. I insist." Linda moved to stop him, but Mrs. Patterson stepped between them. Despite being in her 60s, the older woman had a fierce look in her eyes that made Linda think twice about pushing past her. "You've done enough damage for one day," Mrs. Patterson told Linda firmly. "Let the girl call her family." Zara took the phone with trembling hands and dialed a number she knew by heart. While she waited for someone to answer, she carefully placed the torn pieces of her grandmother's scarf in her lap, trying to see if the damage could somehow be repaired. The golden threads that had once been woven so beautifully through the fabric were now loose and scattered. Some of them were missing entirely, probably lost on the airplane floor. The main tear went right through the center of the scarf, where a delicate pattern of flowers had been embroidered by hand decades ago. As Zara held the phone to her ear, listening to it ring, she thought about her grandmother. What would she say about this situation? Her grandmother had always taught her to respond to hatred with grace, to meet cruelty with kindness. But right now, Grace felt very far away. "Dad?" she said when someone finally answered. Her voice cracked as she spoke. Something terrible happened, on the plane. She didn't notice that several passengers had gone quiet to listen to her phone call. She also didn't realize that Linda had moved closer, trying to hear what she was saying. "A flight attendant tore off grandmother's scarf," Zara continued, her voice getting stronger as she talked to her father. "She ripped it right off my head in front of everyone. It's torn in 2 places and I don't know if it can be fixed." There was a long pause as she listened to her father's response. The passengers watching could see her face change as he spoke. To her, some of the fear and sadness was being replaced by something else, a quiet strength that seemed to come from knowing that someone who loved her was on her side. "I know, Dad. "I know you always taught me to stand up for what's right," she said into the phone. "But I also know you taught me to do it the right way." Linda had been trying to eavesdrop on the conversation, hoping to hear something she could use to justify her actions. Instead, she heard a young woman talking to her father about doing the right thing, even when others had done wrong to her. For the first time since the incident began, Linda felt a small flicker of doubt about her actions. Captain Robert Hayes was doing his final pre-flight checks when his phone buzzed with an urgent message from the flight crew. 22 years of flying had taught him that when crew members sent emergency alerts, it usually meant serious trouble. "We have a situation in the cabin that requires your immediate attention," the message read. "Passenger complaint involving crew member conduct." Robert sighed and saved his checklist. In all his years of flying, he had seen everything from medical emergencies to unruly passengers, but something about this message felt different. He made his way from the cockpit toward the first-class cabin, wondering what he would find. The moment he stepped into the passenger area, he could feel the tension in the air. Conversations were happening in hushed, angry tones. Several passengers were holding up their phones, clearly recording or sharing something online. In the center of it all stood Linda, looking flustered and defensive, while a young woman sat in seat 3A with tears still visible on her cheeks. "What's the situation here?" Captain Hayes asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Linda immediately stepped forward, eager to give her version of events first. "Captain, we had a passenger who refused to comply with safety regulations. She was wearing a head covering that violated our dress code, and when I asked her to remove it, she became argumentative and uncooperative." Robert looked around the cabin at the faces of the passengers. Their expressions told a completely different story than what Linda was saying. Mrs. Patterson was shaking her head in disbelief, while David Chen was holding up his phone with what appeared to be a video ready to play. "Ma'am," Captain Hayes said to Zara, "could you please tell me what happened from your perspective?" Zara looked up at the captain, still clutching the torn pieces of her grandmother's headscarf. Her voice was quiet but clear as she recounted the events. "I was sitting in my seat reading when the flight attendant told me to remove my headscarf. I explained that it was religious clothing, but she insisted I take it off. When I asked to speak with you, she became angry and she ripped it off my head." She held up the torn fabric, and Captain Hayes could see the damage clearly. The beautiful blue material was torn in multiple places, with golden threads hanging loose and scattered. "I have video of the entire incident," David Chen interrupted, holding up his phone. "The passenger was completely peaceful. She never raised her voice or caused any disturbance. The flight attendant grabbed her headscarf and tore it off without any justification." "That's not true," Linda protested. "She was being defiant, and I was there too," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "I saw the whole thing. That young lady was just sitting quietly reading her book. She wasn't bothering anyone. What your employee did was completely unacceptable." More passengers began speaking up, each confirming the same version of events. The college student with the journalism sweatshirt showed Captain Hayes his phone screen, where a video was already playing. Robert watched in growing dismay as he saw Linda aggressively confront Zara and then physically rip the headscarf from her head. "Linda," Captain Hayes said, his voice now carrying a tone of serious concern, "you're suspended from duty for the remainder of this flight. Please report to the crew rest area immediately." "Captain, you don't understand," Linda said, desperately. "I was just doing my job. We have to maintain security standards." "What I understand," Robert replied, "is that I just watched a video of you assaulting a passenger who was causing no disturbance whatsoever. There are no airline policies that require passengers to remove religious head coverings. Your actions were completely unjustified." As Linda reluctantly headed toward the back of the plane, Captain Hayes turned his attention to Zara. He knelt down next to her seat so they could speak more privately. "Miss, I want to personally apologize for what happened to you today. This is not how our airline operates, and it's certainly not how our passengers should be treated. I know that doesn't fix what was done, but I want you to know that this will be fully investigated." Zara nodded, still looking down at her torn headscarf. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said softly. She passed away 3 years ago, and this was one of the few things I had left of hers. Captain Hayes felt his heart sink. This wasn't just about airline policies or customer service failures. This was about someone's precious family heirloom being destroyed by ignorance and prejudice. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to everyone on the plane, the videos of the incident were already spreading rapidly across social media. David Chen had uploaded his footage with the caption, "Airline employee assaults passenger for wearing religious headscarf. This is completely unacceptable." The journalism student had posted his video to multiple platforms, and Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter was sharing the story after her grandmother texted her about what she had witnessed. Within 30 minutes of the incident, hashtags were beginning to trend. People were sharing the videos with comments like, "This is absolutely disgusting," and "How is this still happening in 2025? The airline's social media accounts were being flooded with angry messages demanding answers and justice. Back on the plane, Zara was making another phone call to her father. This time, she had more details to share about what had happened and how the other passengers and captain had responded. "The captain seems like a good man, Dad," she said into the phone. "He suspended the flight attendant and apologized to me personally. But I'm still really upset about grandmother's scarf. I don't know if it can be repaired." She paused to listen to her father's response, unaware that her words were being heard by several nearby passengers who were impressed by her mature and thoughtful way of handling such a traumatic situation. "I know you're angry, Dad. I can hear it in your voice even though you're trying to stay calm for me. But please don't do anything rash. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." What Zara didn't know was that her father, Vincent Williams, was the CEO and founder of the very airline she was flying on. At that moment, he was sitting in his corporate office, staring out the window at the city skyline, feeling a mixture of rage and heartbreak that his own daughter had been treated this way by one of his employees. Vincent had built Skyline Airlines from nothing, starting with a single used aircraft and a dream of creating an airline that treated every passenger with dignity and respect. He had faced discrimination himself as a young black entrepreneur trying to break into the aviation industry, and he had sworn that his company would be different. Now, his own daughter had been humiliated and assaulted by someone wearing his company's uniform. Vincent picked up his phone and started making calls. First, he called his head of human resources, then his legal department, then his head of operations. Within minutes, his entire executive team was mobilizing for an emergency response. "I want Linda Rodriguez's complete employment file on my desk in 1 hour," he told his HR director. "I want to know every complaint that was ever filed against her, every incident report, and why she was still working for this company." His legal team was already preparing for potential lawsuits and media fallout. His operations team was working to identify every passenger on the flight so they could reach out personally to offer compensation and apologies. But Vincent knew that none of that would fix his daughter's broken heart or repair her grandmother's torn headscarf. Back on the plane, Captain Hayes was speaking with the other passengers, gathering contact information from witnesses and ensuring that everyone felt comfortable continuing with the flight. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from anger to a kind of protective solidarity around Zara. "We're all witnesses to what happened here today," Mrs. Patterson announced to the cabin, "and we're not going to let this be swept under the rug." The plane touched down in Atlanta with a gentle bump on the runway. For most passengers, this would normally be the end of their journey and the beginning of whatever brought them to the city. But for everyone on Flight 447, they knew this landing was just the beginning of something much bigger. As the aircraft rolled toward the gate, passengers could see through the small windows that something unusual was waiting for them. News vans were parked near the terminal, their satellite dishes pointing toward the sky. Reporters with cameras were gathered behind security barriers, and airport security personnel were stationed at various points around the gate area. "Looks like word got out," David Chen said to Mrs. Patterson as they both peered out the window. "Good," Mrs. Patterson replied firmly. "The whole world should know what happened here today." Zara was still in her seat, carefully folding the torn pieces of her grandmother's headscarf and placing them in a small bag she had pulled from her carry-on. She felt emotionally drained from the entire experience. but there was also a part of her that felt stronger than when the day had started. Captain Hayes made an announcement over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, due to the incident that occurred during boarding, we'll be conducting a slightly different deplaning process today. Airport security and airline representatives will be meeting with some passengers to gather statements and provide assistance. Thank you for your patience and cooperation throughout this flight. As the passengers began to gather their belongings, many of them stopped by Zara's seat to offer words of support and exchange contact information. The journalism student handed her his business card and promised to make sure the story was told accurately in the media. Mrs. Patterson gave her a warm hug and whispered, "Your grandmother would be proud of how you handled yourself today." Linda, who had been sitting in the crew rest area since Captain Hayes suspended her, was escorted off the plane first by 2 airport security officers. As she walked through the cabin, most passengers deliberately avoided making eye contact with her. She kept her head down, finally beginning to realize the magnitude of what she had done. When Zara finally stood to leave the plane, her legs felt shaky. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was wearing off, and exhaustion was setting in. Captain Hayes personally escorted her off the aircraft, making sure she felt safe and supported. "Miss Williams," he said as they walked up the jet bridge, "I want you to know that I've been flying for over 20 years, and I've never been more disappointed in a crew member's behavior. What happened to you today goes against everything we stand for as an airline." As they reached the gate area, Zara was surprised to see how many people were waiting. Besides the obvious reporters and camera crews being kept at a distance by security, there were several people in business suits who appeared to be airline executives. A woman in her 40s wearing a professional blazer approached them immediately. "Miss Williams, I'm Rebecca Torres, Director of Customer Relations for Skyline Airlines. We have a private room set up where we can talk more comfortably, away from all the cameras and noise." Zara nodded gratefully. The last thing she wanted right now was to deal with reporters shoving microphones in her face. As they walked through the terminal, she could hear people calling out questions and camera flashes going off, but the airline staff and security formed a protective barrier around her. They entered a quiet conference room where several more airline executives were waiting. There was coffee, water, and snacks set up on a side table, and comfortable chairs arranged in a circle rather than the intimidating setup of a boardroom table. "Please, have a seat wherever you're comfortable," Rebecca said gently. "First, I want to personally apologize for what you experienced today. There is absolutely no excuse for how you were treated." As Zara sat down, she noticed one of the executives looked familiar, though she couldn't quite place where she might have seen him before. He was a tall, distinguished-looking black man in his 50s, wearing an expensive but understated suit. There was something about his eyes that reminded her of someone, but she was too tired to figure out who. "We'd like to start by getting your full account of what happened," Rebecca continued. "We want to make sure we have all the details correct as we move forward with our investigation." Zara told her story again, this time in more detail and without the emotional pressure of angry passengers and news cameras. She explained about her grandmother, about the significance of the headscarf, and about how Linda's actions had made her feel. The executives listened carefully, taking notes and asking gentle follow-up questions. The man who looked familiar to her seemed particularly affected by her story. She noticed his hands clench into fists when she described the moment Linda tore the scarf from her head. "Miss Williams," Rebecca said when Zara finished her account, "we want to make this right. We know we can't undo what happened, but we want to do everything in our power to address this situation appropriately." "What's going to happen to Linda?" Zara asked. "I don't want to ruin her life, but I also don't want this to happen to anyone else." The familiar-looking executive spoke for the first time. "Linda Rodriguez has been employed with our airline for 8 years. We're currently reviewing her entire employment history, including any previous complaints or incidents." His voice was deep and authoritative, but also warm. There was something about the way he said her name that made Zara look at him more closely. "We've already discovered," he continued, "that there have been 3 previous complaints filed against Ms. Rodriguez for discriminatory behavior toward passengers. Unfortunately, those complaints were not properly escalated or addressed by middle management." Zara felt a chill run down her spine. You mean she's done this before? Not exactly like this, Rebecca replied. But there have been incidents involving inappropriate comments about passengers' appearance, religion, and ethnicity. It appears there was a pattern of behavior that should have been addressed much sooner. The executive who had been speaking leaned forward in his chair. Miss Williams, can I ask you something personal? You mentioned calling your father during the incident. How is he handling all of this? He's upset, Zara said carefully. She had been wondering when someone would ask about her father. He taught me to always stand up for what's right, but to do it in the right way. He's probably more angry about this than I am, if that's possible. I imagine he would be, the man said softly. Any father would be furious to know his daughter was treated this way. There was something in his tone that made Zara study his face more intently. The shape of his eyes, the way he held his head. When he was thinking, even the way he gestured with his hands, it all seemed so familiar. I'm sorry, she said suddenly. But do I know you? You look really familiar to me. The man exchanged glances with Rebecca and the other executives. There was a moment of silence in the room that felt heavy with unspoken communication. Zara, he said gently, using her first name for the first time. There's something we need to tell you. Something that makes this situation even more serious than you might realize. Zara felt her heart start to beat faster. There was something in his voice that reminded her of the way her father sounded when he had important news to share. My name is Vincent Williams, he said slowly, watching her face carefully. I'm the CEO and founder of Skyline Airlines. Zara stared at him, her mind trying to process what he had just said. Williams was her last name too, but that was just a coincidence, right? Lots of people had the same last name without being related. But as she looked at his face more carefully, recognition finally dawned on her. The eyes that reminded her of someone. They reminded her of her own eyes. The familiar gestures, the way he held himself, the sound of his voice. Dad? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Vincent nodded, his own eyes filling with tears. Hello, sweetheart. I'm so sorry this happened to you. I'm so sorry that someone wearing my company's uniform hurt you this way. The room fell completely silent as Zara processed this revelation. Her father, the man who had built this airline from nothing, who employed thousands of people, who had always taught her about treating everyone with dignity and respect, was sitting right there. All the executives in the room suddenly understood why this case had been given such immediate and serious attention. They weren't just dealing with a discrimination incident. They were dealing with an assault on their CEO's daughter. For several long moments, father and daughter just stared at each other across the conference room. Zara felt like her whole world had suddenly shifted. All this time, she had been calling her dad about an incident on an airplane, not knowing that it was his airplane, his company, his employee who had hurt her. I can't believe this, Zara whispered, shaking her head. All these years you never told me you owned the airline. Vincent leaned forward in his chair, his expression filled with both love and pain. I wanted you to have a normal college experience. I didn't want you to be treated differently because of who your father is. I wanted you to be judged on your own character, not on my success. Well, that backfired pretty spectacularly, Zara said with a weak laugh that was part humor and part exhaustion. Rebecca Torres and the other executives were quietly gathering their papers, realizing this had become a deeply personal family moment. But Vincent held up his hand to stop them. No, please stay, he said. What happened to Zara affects every passenger who flies with us. This isn't just about my daughter. It's about the kind of company we are and the kind of company we want to be. He turned back to Zara, reaching across to take her hands in his. Sweetheart, I am so sorry. Not just as your father, but as the person responsible for creating the culture where someone like Linda felt comfortable treating you that way. Zara squeezed her father's hands. Dad, this isn't your fault. You didn't teach her to be prejudiced. You didn't tell her to rip off my headscarf. No, but I created the systems that should have stopped her long before she got to you, Vincent replied. Rebecca told you there were previous complaints about Linda's behavior. Those complaints should have reached my desk. The fact that they didn't means we have serious problems in our management structure. Over the next hour, Vincent and his team outlined the immediate steps they were taking. Linda Rodriguez was being terminated, not just for the assault on Zara, but for the pattern of discriminatory behavior that the investigation had uncovered. 3 middle managers who had failed to properly report or address the previous complaints were also being disciplined. But that's just the beginning, Vincent explained. We're completely overhauling our diversity and inclusion training. Every employee, from baggage handlers to executives, will go through new programs designed to prevent incidents like this. What about the other passengers? Zara asked. Mrs. Patterson, David Chen, all the people who stood up for me, they shouldn't be forgotten in all this. Rebecca smiled. We've already reached out to every passenger on that flight. They're all receiving full refunds, travel vouchers, and personal letters of thanks for their courage in speaking up. Several of them have agreed to participate in our new training videos. Vincent pulled out his phone and showed Zara the screen. The videos from your flight have been shared millions of times already. The whole world is talking about what happened, and honestly, most of the response has been positive. People are praising the passengers who defended you and condemning Linda's actions. Zara looked at the social media posts scrolling across the screen. Comments like, "This is why we need to stand up for each other," and "Those passengers restored my faith in humanity," filled the feed. There were also thousands of messages of support, directed at her personally, even though most people didn't know she was the CEO's daughter. There's something else I want to discuss with you, Vincent said carefully. The media is going to find out who you are eventually. When they do, this story is going to get even bigger. We need to decide how we want to handle that. Zara was quiet for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened. Just this morning, she had been a regular college student heading back to school. Now she was at the center of a national conversation about discrimination and civil rights. I think we should tell them, she said finally. But not because I'm your daughter. I think we should tell them because this story shows that discrimination can happen to anyone. Anywhere. If it can happen to the CEO's daughter in first class, imagine what happens to people who don't have anyone looking out for them. Vincent's face broke into a proud smile. You know, that's exactly what your grandmother would have said. Speaking of grandmother, Zara said, pulling the torn headscarf from her bag. Is there any way this can be fixed? Rebecca leaned forward to examine the damaged fabric. We've already contacted 3 of the best textile restoration specialists in the country. They all believe the scarf can be repaired, though it will take time and careful work. Really? Zara's eyes filled with tears of relief. It can actually be fixed? Not just fixed, Vincent said. We're going to make sure it's restored to exactly the way it was when your grandmother wore it. And we're going to use the restoration process as part of a documentary about the importance of preserving cultural heritage and treating everyone's traditions with respect. 3 days later, Vincent and Zara stood together at a podium in front of a room full of reporters. The story had indeed grown even bigger once news broke that the victim was the airline CEO's daughter. But instead of focusing on that angle, they used the platform to talk about something more important. What happened to my daughter could have happened to anyone, Vincent told the gathered media. The fact that she's my daughter makes it personal, for me. But it should be personal for all of us when anyone is treated with such disrespect and cruelty. Zara stepped up to the microphone holding her grandmother's headscarf, which had been expertly restored to its original beauty. This scarf represents my heritage, my faith, and my family's history. When Linda tore it from my head, she wasn't just attacking a piece of fabric. She was attacking everything I am and everything my family stands for. She paused, looking out at the cameras and reporters. But what happened next is just as important as the attack itself. Complete strangers stood up for me. They refused to let hatred win. Mrs. Patterson gave me her sweater. David Chen shared his phone and recorded everything to make sure the truth came out. Captain Hayes took immediate action to make things right. That's the story I want people to remember, she continued. Not just that one person did something terrible, but that so many other people chose to do something good. In the weeks that followed, Vincent announced the creation of the Heritage Respect Foundation, named in honor of Zara's grandmother's headscarf. The foundation would provide cultural sensitivity training for transportation workers across the entire industry, not just at Skyline Airlines. Zara decided to take a semester off from college to work with the foundation. She traveled to other airlines, airports, and transportation companies, sharing her story and helping to develop training programs that would prevent similar incidents. Linda Rodriguez faced legal consequences for her actions and struggled to find new employment in the service industry. The incident followed her everywhere, serving as a harsh reminder that actions have consequences. Eventually, she enrolled in counseling and cultural sensitivity courses, beginning a long journey toward understanding the harm she had caused. 6 months later, Zara wore her grandmother's restored headscarf to her college graduation. In her valedictorian speech, she talked about how the worst day of her life had led to some of the most meaningful work she had ever done. My grandmother always told me that we are defined not by what happens to us, but by how we choose to respond, she said to the graduating class. When someone tried to take away my dignity, strangers gave it back to me. When someone tried to destroy something precious to my family, my father's company made it whole again. When someone tried to silence my voice, the whole world listened. Mrs. Patterson and David Chen were both in the audience that day, invited as honored guests. As Zara walked across the stage to receive her diploma, they stood and applauded along with everyone else, knowing they had played a part in helping a young woman turn a moment of hatred into a lifetime of positive change.